what percentage of the full value are we currently at if you have such a number?
It's a wild range of numbers, but I think Bitcoin's market capitalization should be between 10 and 200 trillion would be the most appropriate valuation.
Isn't that like larger? Come on.
So we've got a couple different ways.
200 trillion is larger than the world GDP, isn't it? I think.
Well, here's a couple different ways to think about it. One, right. So we would need to look at the TAM, total addressable market of store value assets, right? We've got gold. Gold is at, I think, $10 to $12 trillion right now, is aggregate value of all gold in the world.
Yeah.
So that would be gold. Then you have fiat currency.
Okay.
So fiat currency, I think, is approximately 40 to 50 trillion. Then you've got sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is used as a store of value. Bitcoin doesn't singularly just compete with gold. It competes with any other. And gold similarly doesn't compete with just fiat. It competes with all other stores of value. And then you've got real estate, which is a very common store of value asset across the world. And that's a $250 trillion market. Note that all of these have inherently weaker characteristics as a store of value asset than Bitcoin. None of them are digitally native. A lot of them can be seized and censored. There's other things that you can't do with them as well. They're not divisible. They're not very durable. And so Bitcoin, in terms of its monetary attributes, make it a very, very sexy store of value asset, to where Bitcoin ultimately at some point competes with real estate as well. I mean, we've seen real estate prices in the US go up 23% year over year. It's not because 23%, it's not because the homes became 23%, had 23% more utility. It was 23% more due to inflation concerns being baked into the price, supply issues as well. So you've got tightening supply, increased demand to use it as a store of value asset. Cities like San Francisco, New York, and London, double-digit percentages of those apartments and homes in those cities are literally empty because they're just used as a store of value asset. So if we were to properly evaluate Bitcoin's TAM, that's the banded range between, I would say, like 20 trillion and 200 trillion. So somewhere in there, which makes the price of Bitcoin, in the millions is where I think it would be appropriately priced long term. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to happen over the next year. This would be over a very long duration.
25, 40
in today's dollars.
Right, of course. Okay. All right. So adjusted for inflation, of course, millions of dollars. So let me give you one counter argument, and you can tell me where maybe I'm getting this wrong. Can we go back to the adoption chart real quick? I'm noticing here that most of these technologies, as they become more adopted by more people, they become also cheaper, and I would say one could argue less valuable because it's more commonplace. Once upon a time, it was very difficult to make a call long distance. Nowadays, it's virtually free. Same thing with air travel. Same thing with basically everything else I see on this chart. So what's stopping me from making the argument that as Bitcoin becomes more adopted by end users, it becomes less valuable as less sexy, so to speak, as an asset? Less people would assign higher value to it, and would probably as transactions, as protocols, second layer protocols get developed, transactions get made through Bitcoin, the cost of transactions become cheaper, and so the price should, in theory, fall. Am I getting this wrong, Dan?
Yeah, I think so, because inherently money is a network effect. The cost to do something is somewhat tied to the utility of Bitcoin is in storing value in it. Now, I think you're asking about the transaction costs. Well, with layer 2 technology, transaction costs can decrease while adoption increases, such as Lightning. Lightning is a layer 2 tech where it costs it's a very, very cheap way to transact. We're talking hundredths or thousandth of a penny to move a large amount of value. So from the raw utility of being able to move it, now storing value in it, you only need to move it once. But if you want to move it many times, layer 2 technology is enabled to become cheaper to move around as more and more people adopt it. So that's not a big concern. Also, money is a network effect, which means that as it grows in value, it becomes more valuable for all market participants, including new ones. New ones might complain, I didn't get in early, or I didn't see it early, but that's immaterial because they need to use it for its properties as a money. Bitcoin's properties as a money, like I said before, it's a digitally and native asset. There's no trust required with any institution to send it. And it's immutable, it's not censorable, and the monetary policy cannot be changed. So due to those factors, people, even if there is no price appreciation in Bitcoin, the value to hold it and use it because it's immutable and because no one can take it away from you is immensely valuable.
Right. I guess maybe it's unfair to compare it to some forms of technology then, because it is fundamentally not an appliance to be used. It's a form of money. If you were to make that assumption, it has to have the properties of money, and so therefore the properties of money are fundamentally different than properties of new technology. And so maybe the adoption curve would look different. Maybe we should be comparing it to the adoption curve of, let's say, other forms of currency, or perhaps even gold or something.
It would be cool to have the gold data. There was a transition period.
Thousands of
I don't think we have any records that go back that far, but I'm sure there was a conversation to be had between folks who had other assets like shells and beads, and they could argue the traits of those were superior than gold. And I'm sure these conversations happen just like that too. So unfortunately, the record doesn't go back that far, but we could be sure that humans were speculating on gold's potential as a store of value asset. And we've seen that with other metals. Silver, right? Silver is a commonly used one for people to speculate that, there might be a bimetallic sort of standard. So yeah, we've certainly seen speculation, and we've seen adoption curves of other precious metals as store of values.
Okay. Finally, let's talk about regulation. There's been a trend of tightening of regulation all around the world. Earlier this year, Turkey banned cryptocurrencies as a form of payment. China started cracking down on its miners recently. And of course, a couple weeks ago, Binance was recently unauthorized by the Italian officials. But what's going on here? It's all happening this year, by the way.
Well, the ban in India actually happened last year. So that's somewhat, these bans occur every year in different countries. I think this year, you're right, there's a higher frequency of them than usual. So a lot of different geopolitical things at play here with what's going on in Europe and Binance. I think Binance was playing hard and fast with the rules. I used to work with CZ back at blockchain.com. I think he's a great leader. I think he's an exceptional thinker. His strategy was a little bit more aggressive than other companies like Kraken, where Kraken and Coinbase, we play by the rules. We follow all the different local regulations that we need to. So I don't think that's like necessarily a broad shutdown of crypto. I think that's a representation of the crypto Wild West era might be over. And so that's what we're seeing in Europe right now, because we haven't had any issues yet. With countries banning Bitcoin completely, like countries like China banning Bitcoin, that narrative has actually occurred over 50 times in the last 10 years, that China was banning Bitcoin. What actually was occurring is a wide variety of different types of smaller bans, prohibited nature, like prohibited types of things you could do with it. This latest one was banning Bitcoin mining. Yes. I would say that was a big boon for the industry, because a lot of people's concerns over Bitcoin were that there are a lot of Bitcoin miners in China and that they use dirty electricity. And now that both of those concerns have been defeated because there are no more miners in China. Also, when we saw the miners in China leave, we found that they only had around 35 to 40% of the network, which miners don't control Bitcoin, by the way. They're more of like the paid guards to ensure that the ordering of transaction goes properly. But it does, kind of defeats that FUD, or that fear, uncertainty, and doubt around China and Bitcoin. Right. Now, when we look at what does the future hold, I think that's probably the deeper question here. How will governments respond as Bitcoin grows in adoption? Well, inherently, Bitcoin and government monies compete. So they should be hesitant to embrace it in some degree. However, what happens when 40% of your population owns it? These include politicians and police and military and investigators at different tax agencies. When that occurs, it becomes very problematic to be able to do anything in terms of banning it or removing it, because 40% of the population now believes it. And if you were a politician to vote for something like that, you would not be voted in, because people vote with their pocketbook, and you've just made them much poorer. Also, the level of compliance would likely be low. And compliance as in individual wallet users voluntarily providing information or adhering to different policies. If you make a policy so unpopular that most of the population doesn't like it, is that really a law if everyone just breaks it? So Bitcoin's protection against government shutting it down is a function of adoption. As it grows more in adoption, it becomes harder and harder to isolate those people that would believe in it and penalize them or try to remove Bitcoin.
Just one more point, and I'll let you go, Dan. The skeptics of Bitcoin will point to tighter regulations as a reason to not own Bitcoin. If you take a look at China's shutdown of the miners, for example, what we saw immediately was a decline in the hash rate, a drop that we haven't seen in a long time of that scale. And if you overlay the hash rate drop to a chart of the Bitcoin price, you can see, again, correlation is not causation except according to the Texas professors there. But you could definitely see a correlation there. So what I'm trying to say is whether or not I'm trying to ask you whether or not regulations as a whole are a tailwind or a headwind for Bitcoin.
Definitely a headwind, right? Any increased regulatory crackdown means harder participation, means more negativity. All prices across the world for any asset reflect information of what people's aggregate belief or sentiment is around the asset. If news is bullish about Apple, then the price is likely to continue to climb as people become more bullish. With Bitcoin, it's the same thing. Regulatory news is typically negative. Now, there are some instances where regulators become more permissive or give very clear guidance, and that reduces an uncertainty. So I would say regulatory uncertainty is probably the most negative type of news. Regulatory certainty that's not too restrictive or really clamps down, I think is positive news because it clears that up for everyone else.